Good afternoon, friends. My name is Gary Allen. I'm the president of the Maryland Forestry Foundation. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this edition of Framing the Future, a program of webinars offered each month on the third Thursday at 1 o'clock when we talk about issues that we believe will affect the entire future of Maryland's forest resources. We've been asked many, many, many times by a number of groups that we partner with, particularly by local forestry boards and their members, which constitute over 150 local volunteers, what they can do in the advocacy area to be supportive of forestry legislation, to provide information to the legislature, and ultimately respond to requests from local citizens about information about public issues. These issues are vexing for many people and hot potatoes for others. We thought it'd be helpful to bring in some experts to talk about it, and so we're pleased to have a special program on that subject today. I want to remind all of you that we'll be looking forward to working with you more in the months ahead on these and similar issues. But today's moderator is our uh, board member and former Mel Fellow, Megan Carr, and she'll introduce today's distinguished speaker. Megan?
Thank you, Gary, and apologizing in advance for my ornery cat getting in the way. Yes, we're very pleased to be joined today by Tim Mooney, who I'll introduce in just a moment. I'll make a couple of brief housekeeping notes for those of you in the audience before we get started. So if you were forwarded information about this session and would like to directly receive info from the Foundation about future webinar subjects, you can go over to marylandforestryfoundation.org and find the page on webinars where you can sign up for our email list. We will only send you information about these sessions, so about once a month. You can hear from us about what we have on the deck for you. We welcome questions for our speaker today. Please enter those in the Q&A chat box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And we have time set aside at the end of today's session for Tim to answer all of your burning questions. And yes, today we are joined by Tim Mooney, the Senior Counsel at Alliance for Justice, where he has guided nonprofits through the maze of political and tax-exempt law for over 2 decades. His ability to present legal concepts in an interesting and accessible way is heightened by his passion for making a positive difference for every community. At the heart of his work, Tim empowers organizations to elevate their impact, challenge the status quo, and drive meaningful progress. So thank you, Tim. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Megan. Thank you also, Gary, for introducing all of this. Hello, everybody. I'm super excited to be presenting today. I'm joining you from Seattle, Washington. So I'm about 3 hours of caffeination behind you. Also, my internet connection, because of course, is a little unstable today. So I will get pinged if I end up freezing on you, and hopefully we won't have that be an issue for us today. As Megan noted, I'm an attorney with Alliance for Justice in the Boulder Advocacy Program. I've been practicing law in this area around advocacy of nonprofits for the better part of the last couple of decades or so. Weir River Watershed. I've been doing a ton of work in the DC area for a bunch of years and have just recently relocated out here to Seattle. Your work is fascinating to me. I went to the State University of New York College of Environmental Science and Forestry, so I love me some trees. I love all of the different types of work that you do within the state of Maryland and beyond. And I'm very excited to be able to kind of give a sense of what you can do as organizations around advocacy activity. It turns out that we've got some limitations in what we can do as 501c3 organizations, but we're also allowed to do quite a bit. It's a very permissive structure. So I want to hopefully at the end of the day here today, present to you for a little while, have plenty of time for questions at the end. And as mentioned before, we'll do that through the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen or the side of your screen. I'm in presenter mode, so I'm not 100% sure where it is. I'm going to start sharing my deck here. By the way, you're going to get a copy of this deck after the fact and also a whole bunch of different resources as well made available to you. So don't worry about furiously scribbling down notes if you don't want to. Feel free to just kind of sit back and listen and enjoy. All right. So today we're going to be talking about the distinctions between advocacy and lobbying. For a lot of folks, they'll conflate those two things together. As it turns out, advocacy doesn't really have a legal definition, but it's very broad. And one of the possible ways to advocate is lobbying. That's the only thing that's really limited for us. And we'll get into all of that. We'll also talk about the lay of the land, the different types of tax-exempt organizations. There are multiple different types. That's why what you'll find is some nonprofit organizations that you run into are going to be doing things that are beyond what you can do. And I'm going to be talking about the different types of these tax-exempt organizations and what their abilities are and how they differ based on basically the structure of the tax code. Then we'll get into the whole concept of staying in compliance with the limitations that we've got as part of our being a tax-exempt organization, a C3 in particular. And then we'll get into the definitions of lobbying, the exceptions to the lobbying activity that actually is really a good sweet spot for organizations like yours to occupy. We'll cover those. And then, of course, we'll get to your questions at the very end of the time together today. So we'll start off with the different types of nonprofits or tax-exempt organizations. So when we're talking a little more loosey-goosey, we conflate those two things. Nonprofit, what makes something a nonprofit is the state-level regulation of your corporation. That's what makes you a nonprofit. Tax exempt, the federal law, federal tax law. And as a tax lawyer, I still sheepishly admit that, we name things after the sections of the tax code. That's why you keep hearing me say and others 501c3 this and 501c4 that. Those are the sections of the federal tax code where that govern our organizations. And I say ours because my organization, Alliance for Justice, is a 501c3 public charity, as is Maryland Forestry Foundation, American Forests on the national level, and effectively, I would imagine almost all of you, if not all of you as well. Treatment for public charity, great. The first thing that we get is we're tax exempt, which means that we don't tend to pay taxes to any level of government. There are some exceptions here and there, but none worth really getting into today. That tax exemption is a really big deal. The bigger deal, however, for a public charity is their ability to confer tax deductibility to their donors. So if someone makes a donation to your organization, they're able to write that off on their federal taxes. And that's super helpful for especially larger donors. It's sort of a groove in the tax code that's been written in that makes private foundation grants easier to go to C3 public charities. It's a really big deal. It's not exclusive to public charities in the tax code, but it's close enough that I would characterize this as the best tax treatment under the law. And if there's one thing that I've noticed practicing law in this area for longer than I'd like to admit, is that the better your tax treatment, the more restrictions we tend to see on advocacy. And as I mentioned before, advocacy doesn't really have a legal definition, but I'm going to talk about two different types that would fall underneath that umbrella. The first is lobbying activity, and we're going to spend most of our time this afternoon talking about the definitions of lobbying and the limitations around it. But suffice to say, you're allowed to engage in lobbying activity. You're just limited in how much you can engage in. The other type of advocacy activity that I think is worth mentioning, although we won't spend as much time on it, we're in an election year. It's important to know you can do all sorts of things around election years. You are allowed to help people find their precinct, to remind people that an election is coming up. You can do just about any type of voter engagement so long as you are not taking a stance for or against any that's running for it. Like that, you've crossed the line. You run the risk of losing your tax exempt status just for that. And so that's why public charities are really, really careful around all of that. Now, you'll notice that I was very careful to say that it's candidates that you can't take a stance on. I'll get to ballot measures and the like later. It's a special rule that actually falls under the lobbying category, believe it or not. bunch of different other types of organizations that exist out there that are also tax exempt, but they play by a different set of rules. Sometimes they're affiliated organizations, like my organization, Alliance for Justice, has an affiliated sister organization, Alliance for Justice Action. It's a 501c4 organization. You may, from time to time, work with labor unions or even trade associations. Those are 501c5s and 501c6s, respectively. They're treated the same for purposes of this chart, but they're all categorized differently based on their exempt purpose. For social welfare organizations, they tend to be the advocacy organizations, or the ones that we tend to see do more advocacy work. And you'll see why in a second. Let's start off by talking about their tax treatment. And again, this also applies to unions and trade associations as well. Tax exempt organizations, they don't pay taxes, just like a C3. But you'll notice what's missing is they can't confer tax deductibility to their donors. So that's not quite as good of a tax treatment. It's harder to raise money for these organizations because they don't have that very valuable treatment. Remember what I told you before. The better your tax treatment, the more restrictions we tend to see on advocacy. The flip is also true. If your tax treatment isn't quite as good, like these organizations, we would expect them to be able to engage in more advocacy activity. And that is absolutely true around lobbying activity. These organizations can do an unlimited amount of lobbying. And that's really handy. Many of you don't have an affiliated C4 organization like my organization does, but you doubtlessly are going to be working in coalitions that might include some of these organizations. So if you're going to be engaged in legislative work or other policy work with a 501c4, that's super handy because they don't have the same limitations in amount of lobbying that they can engage in. Super handy, like I said, in the coalition context. Around elections, they have a little bit of a different treatment as well. All of these organizations can do anything that a 501c3 public charity can do. So like us, they can do all the nonpartisan election work and voter engagement that they want. If they want to register voters in a nonpartisan way, no problem. That is what we call their primary activity. It includes all the C3 types of stuff that can include lobbying, that can include nonpartisan election-related work. As a secondary activity, they split off from C3s. Because their tax treatment isn't as good, they are allowed to engage in activity that supports or opposes candidates. So you're going to see around election time a lot of these C4s and maybe some labor unions making endorsements for candidates. They are allowed to do that. Their tax treatment's different, so they are allowed to do that type of activity. So if you're in coalition with a 501c4, you can work with them on all sorts of different things that are within your wheelhouse, lobbying included. But what you can't do is join in with their endorsements. You can't do that at all. You can't uplift it in social media. You can't do anything along those lines. You have to remember there's that distinction. And that's why I put this chart up, so that everybody gets a sense of the fact that yes, there are other types of nonprofits, and yes, they are going to do different things at different times of year. The tax law restrictions are looser for them, and that's why. And the reason is because it's harder for them to raise money, essentially. I'm kind of yada-yadaing that a little bit here. But those are the different types of nonprofits. You're mostly C3s in this space. You might be working with some C4s or labor unions. Backing up again, I wanted to reiterate the concept of advocacy not having a legal definition. I mentioned already two different types of advocacy, that partisan political work, which I'm red lighting. We can't do any of that as public charities. Lobbying, I give a yellow light, not because there's caution involved with doing lobbying. You're allowed to do it. It's just that you're limited in how much you can do. So we give that a yellow light. Anything else that I would call advocacy, and this is not an exhaustive list here, everything that's in green, it's largely, it's all unlimited, and it's largely unregulated. So organizing work, education work, research, reports, trainings like this one, litigation. I used to sue polluters under the Clean Water Act. That is absolutely a form of advocacy, I can tell you that much. None of this stuff is limited under the law. Some of it is lightly regulated. There might be some disclosure requirements, for instance, in the state of Maryland, if you're going to be making connections with regulatory agencies, that might be a part of a disclosure type of a thing, but it's not limited at all. So advocacy advocacy can take on a whole bunch of different forms. It's not merely lobbying, although lobbying is super important as well. Let's talk about measuring and tracking lobbying activity. And the reason why I spend so much more time on this than on the other stuff is this is the area that's limited. And so when we know what our lobbying are, then we know what lobbying is not. And if it's not lobbying, it fits in one of those green bubbles, basically. And so that's why we spend so much time on this. So this is a weird quirk of the law. Very rarely in the law do you get a choice. I mean, you get a choice to comply or not comply, I suppose. But under this area of law, you have two different methods that you can choose as an organization to measure your lobbying activity. If you do nothing else but form your organization, you don't specifically choose the other method that I'm going to talk about in a moment, you're working under what's called the insubstantial part test. And that's the default. That means that you don't have to do a thing to be working under this test. The interesting thing about this is that it's very inclusive and very broad. So inclusive, it includes all activity, whether you pay for it, you make an expenditure, or it's volunteer activities. It's your board member, unpaid board member, going to meet with a state legislator. It's a lobby day where you're bringing together volunteers. All of that ends up counting under this particular measurement system. The one thing that I'll say is that its definition of lobbying is very broad. And it doesn't have a ton of detail. It's not impossible to deal with, but it's very inclusive. And worse, I would say, though, is the definition of your limit is not defined. I know that may sound a little strange, but you're not allowed to do any more than an insubstantial amount of lobbying. And then the IRS and tax law and Congress and the regulations are silent as to what insubstantial means. And so over the many decades that this rule has been in place for charitable organizations, we've gotten to the point as lawyers that we can come up with best practices here. And that's somewhere in the 3 to 5% of your organization's overall activities. And so it's a pretty limited amount, but we can feel somewhat safe operating in that space. For a lot of your organizations, you're maybe doing a lobby day a year. You might be engaged in a small amount of work at the local level or at the state level. You're not going to be doing a ton of work. This test works just fine for someone like you, because no matter what, you can organize yourself in a way that the definitions aren't so difficult to deal with, and you know darn well that the amount of work that you're doing is well below 3 to 5% of your overall activities in a whole year. So you can very end up in the space. Amount of lobbying, though, I've often said that the other option, the one that you have to affirmatively select, it's called the 501h expenditure test. I think this one is a little bit easier to work with, and I think the reporting requirements are a lot easier as well. The hoop you have to jump through is hardly a hoop at all. You fill out a half-page IRS form, which happens to be my favorite IRS form, largely because it's a half page long. It's Form 5768. You send that off to Ogden, Utah, and you never hear from them again. It basically just says, hey, IRS, we want to work under this set of rules around our lobbying activity. What does it buy you? It buys you more clear definitions of lobbying, and so clear we're going to actually go through them in a few minutes here. And it also does something I think that makes life a lot easier for you. Instead of everything counting, including non-expenditure activities, volunteer work, things like that, the only thing that counts as lobbying is stuff you spend money on. So you have that going for you, and therefore your limits are dollar-based as well. You don't have to get into this whole game of going, well, how much was it worth for our board member to go talk to the state senator, and making kind of fair market valuations and trying to figure out things that way. That ends up being a lot easier when all is said and done. So only your spending counts, not your volunteer work. That can be really powerful for organizations like yours, that rely a lot on volunteer lines. The other thing that I'll say is that the reporting obligations are much easier for this. You're reporting just once a year to the IRS on either of these things. But under the insubstantial part test, you have to do it under their kind of accounting system. You have to take your accounting system and break it up into 7 different cost centers that may not align really well with your accounting and report that specifically on your Form 990, your annual return every year. If you're working under the 501H expenditure test, you're only giving 3 numbers. You're giving the 2 types of lobbying, which I'll get into in a moment. And for reasons that absolutely baffle me, because I know the IRS has calculators, they make you add it up and report the 3rd number as well. That's it. Much easier from a reporting perspective. This is what your lobbying limit would look like. I became a lawyer so I could avoid doing math, and then look where I ended up, right? So for most organizations, if your total spend in a year is $500,000 or less, you can lobby up to 20% of your overall expenditures. That's 1 out of every $5 spent on lobbying. That is a really generous amount. By the way, compare and contrast that to our best practices with the other system. That's only 3 to 5%. So that's really already you're showing a lot more capacity working under this test as well. If you are a larger organization, you'll notice that there's almost like kind of a reverse income tax formula here. Your dollar value will go up even as your percentage ends up going down. So the larger the organization, you can lobby more, but your percentage is going to be less. There is a hard cap. I'm sorry to dissuade those of you who have $17 million budgets or higher, but there is a hard cap of $1 million under these rules. This is not something that many organizations have to deal with, do they? One other thing that I should mention, and I alluded to it before, under this system, there are 2 definitions of lobbying. 2 laws in a moment. Direct lobbying is the type of lobbying that you're probably thinking of. It's going to legislators saying, hey, here's how we feel about this particular piece of legislation. Please vote for it. That's direct lobbying. The other type is grassroots lobbying, and that's going to the general public saying, hey, here's how we feel about this bill. Now you go contact your legislators. I'll get into more details on these definitions in a bit. For curious reasons, grassroots lobbying is more limited within your overall lobbying cap. You can only lobby up to 1/4 of your cap in grassroots lobbying. The remainder of your cap can be used for direct lobbying. But you're not required to do one or the other. You could spend all of your lobbying limit on direct lobbying if you'd like. You could just do grassroots lobbying, but you can never go over your total cap, and you can never do more than 1/4 of your total cap for grassroots lobbying. Otherwise, you can mix and match. And of course, most organizations don't come anywhere near the top of their cap space unless they're really active in legislative activities. The impression that that's the cure. This is what it would look like if you're a $500,000 a year organization and you're maxing out on your lobbying. You'd be spending 20% of your overall spend is your total lobbying cap space. That's $100,000. 1/4 of that can be used for grassroots and the rest for direct. And you can see that's a lot of your budget that you're spending on lobbying activity, or that you can spend on lobbying activity. One other thing that I'll mention here is that this is an annual limit. At the end of your tax year, if you don't use your lobbying limit, it poof goes away, and then the next day it resets, and you have your total lobbying your lobbying limits are available for the next year. That's how all of this works. It's not an obligation to spend. It is a limitation on what you can, in a maximum way, spend. Takeaways on all of this. I think that it's an easy call to make that 501H election if you plan on doing any real decent amount of lobbying work. If all you're going to do is a lobby day a year and maybe an occasional sign-on letter, I don't think there's any problem working under the insubstantial part test. I think that your reporting requirements would be so minimal because you're not doing a lot of work. But if you are going to be doing more, it's super easy to sign up under the 501H rules. You get way more generous limits. The definitions of lobbying, which we're going to get to in a bit, are a lot less vague. There's the added benefit that if you do end up exceeding your limit, you don't lose your tax status. You would if you work under the insubstantial part test. You just pay an excise tax for the overage under the 501H limits. That's rarely an issue for most organizations, but it's worth noting. You don't get any additional scrutiny working under this test compared to the insubstantial test by the IRS. They've been explicit about that. Frankly, I think in conversations that are anonymous with certain IRS folks, they kind of prefer the 501H rules because they're not as vague. They don't have to make any decisions as to what insubstantial means. It's a number, it's math. And last but not least, the thing that I talked about, it's easier to report your lobbying on your annual return, your Form 990. It doesn't mean you have to do this. I'm just saying that I think that this is probably the better bet for you. So we have some other ways that lobbying is going to be limited for us as C3 organizations, and that's when we promise to folks who give us money that we won't use their money to engage in this activity. So that's something that will come about in grants, and it'll come about in grants particularly when you're working with a government grant, because in virtually every single instance, government grants will say you cannot use our money for lobbying activity. That's a big thing. Private foundations will sometimes restrict it, sometimes won't. We call that a restrictive clause when it says you cannot use this money for lobbying activity. So if there's a clause in your agreement, then you got to follow it. It's kind of like a contract in that sense. And so, like I said, the funders sometimes ask you not to do it. Important to know, their restriction on you is only for the money that they give you. You doubtlessly have other sources of income outside of these grants. Maybe you have individual donors. Maybe you have other grant makers who give you money that don't put restrictions on it. You can still lobby. You just have to use unrestricted funds. That's a really important thing. The flip is also interesting as well. Even with restricted funds, a government grant, a private foundation grant that says don't use this for lobbying, we're going to learn that there's a bunch of different things that we can do that are outside of the definitions of lobbying or otherwise accepted from lobbying that look and feel an awful lot like lobbying, but they're outside of those definitions. You can use restricted grant funds almost always for that non-lobbying advocacy work. Really important to know. The big thing, of course, is we've got to know what lobbying is. And usually by about minute 30 in my presentation, people are sort of going, I still don't know what lobbying is. It's because I haven't gotten to it yet. And so here we go. Let's talk about that. Lobbying under the 501H expenditure test, as I talked about before, comes in two flavors. It's direct lobbying and grassroots lobbying. There are elements to each of these. Some of them overlap, some of them are distinct, and we're going to go through them right now. So direct lobbying, as I talked about before, is the typical type of lobbying that you think about going to legislators, communicating with legislators, and then expressing a view about specific legislation. For grassroots lobbying, the audience is different. As I mentioned before, you're not talking to legislators, you're talking to the general public. And the general public it gets that message from you. But it's not lobbying unless you also give that general public audience a call to action. And I'll get into the specifics in a few minutes on that, but it's basically saying, hey, you, go contact your legislator. And you need all of these elements together, either direct or grassroots, for it to count as lobbying. If you're missing an element in what you're doing, or you're not spending money on it, if you're a 501H elector, doesn't end up counting as lobbying activity. So that's kind of handy information to know. Let's start off with the first common element between the two, and that is communication. This one's easy. It's any way of getting your point of view across. It could be a meeting. It could be a direct message. It could be social media. It could be any type of way of getting your point of view across. Won't even need to spend too much time on that. Let's talk about audience here, because audience matters between whether we're in direct or grassroots lobbying. If we are talking to legislators, we're in direct lobbying analysis. Now, those are folks who are the officials who are the legislative representatives in legislative bodies at the local, state, and federal level. So yes, this is federal law, federal tax law, but it reaches all the way down to local law as well. It's also it includes some flavors that are sort of outside of the Schoolhouse Rock version of legislative bodies, tribal councils, the United Nations, even international legislative bodies. Those also would end up counting. Probably not super relevant for the work you do. You're probably going to be really focused in on the state and local level, occasionally on federal legislation as well. One really interesting thing here is that, to call out Schoolhouse Rock again, executive branch officials are sometimes legislators, which just absolutely puts a hole in all of my knowledge that I learned through a cartoon on Saturday mornings about the three branches of government. Executive branch officials, when they are participating in the formulation of legislation, they are considered legislators. Doesn't happen a lot. I'll use Governor Moore as an example here. Now, he is an executive branch official most of the time. But for purposes of these rules, he is considered a legislator when he does something that would impact legislation, when he is submitting a budget to the state legislature, when he is signing or vetoing bills. If you're talking to him in those contexts, he's actually a legislator, and we have to be concerned, no, not concerned, we have to be mindful of the fact that it could be direct lobbying. Most of the time when you talk to Governor Moore, not going to be lobbying at all for purposes of these rules, but is in narrow circumstances, and so it's worth mentioning. Also worth mentioning, it is snowing in Seattle right now. We do not get that very often. Not legislators. Who are the folks that don't count? Let me tell you, this is a really key thing for a lot of the work that you do, because folks that are not part of legislative bodies but are mostly in executive branch agencies or law enforcement, they don't count at all. They're just not part of this type of regulation under the federal rules. I'm going to focus really a lot, though, on state and county forestry boards, because I'm going to guess, I'd lay a fair amount of money down right now that a lot of your advocacy work is in front of these types of boards. Now, in Maryland, you'll have to forgive me, I don't know if they're elected or appointed. It doesn't matter. If they are elected, it does not matter. Now, you can't take a stance in their elections. We already covered that. But even if they are elected officials in these special purpose boards or government agency, non-legislative agencies, that they are pinned in by the work that they do. A state or a county forestry board can only do forestry related things. They can't pass a Clean Air Act or a Clean Water Act. So the law then treats them as not as important. You're not restricted in how much work you do. Real-time follow-up, Gary has told me that they are appointed in Maryland. So that doesn't end up changing the analysis at all. Advocacy before these entities, never going to be considered lobbying. You're not limited at all in how much you can advocate before them. Now, one thing I do want to kind of earmark here really quickly is I've been talking about federal tax law this whole time. There are other laws that you have to pay attention to from time to time, and state law is going to say sometimes when you're talking to non-legislative officials, it still has to end up being disclosed under Maryland's lobbying disclosure rules. And I've got an entire resource that's going to be available to you that you can take a look and to determine whether any of these types of folks have a reporting obligation. There's never a limitation on how much you can do, but you may need to tell the state that you have contacts with these folks. And I'll make sure that you get that at the end. Legislation. Specific legislation, in fact, is what we call the element here, and that is in common with both direct and grassroots lobbying. This is anything that you can think of off the top of your head. It's a bill that's been submitted to a legislative body, again, local, state, or federal. It's budgets, always. It's a line item in a budget, always. So just because you're only talking about a forestry provision within a larger budget, that still counts. Even if you're not talking about the broader bill, still counts. Draft legislation also counts. Draft legislation that you wrote, that somebody else wrote, even policy proposals where you identify, and this is at the most early point in any kind of a process. Nobody's written this down yet. Maybe it's just an idea that you came up with off the top of your head. It's identifying a problem and then presenting a legislative solution to that problem that can only occur if a new law is passed. That's a policy proposal. And so that counts just as much as an active bill. And so why do I present all of these things together? All of these things count just the same. And it's important to know that last point about policy proposals, because a lot of folks may not be thinking that they, in a conversation with a state senator, may be engaged in lobbying activity if they give an idea for a new piece of legislation, thinking, oh, well, nobody's written this down, so it doesn't count. It actually does count under these rules. If you identify a problem and you suggest drafting and passing legislation that would be required to solve that problem. Policy proposal, important stuff. One other thing that's worth mentioning, ballot measures. I think I seeded this earlier. This is a weird quirk. Normally, when we are in an election context, we're sort of nonpartisan. Not sort of nonpartisan, we are very nonpartisan, because if we are partisan, we lose our tax status. In the ballot measure context, it's a little bit different. The law views a ballot measure as a piece of legislation. It's not a person that's a candidate. It's a piece of legislation that's before a local electorate, could be a bond measure, could be before the entire state if it's a state ballot measure, but it's a piece of legislation, and the voting public is considered a gigantic legislative body for purposes of that communication. And so in this one really weird narrow instance, ballot measures count as lobbying activity. And quirkily enough, you're talking broadly to the general public, but you're talking to the general public as legislators. And so it ends up getting categorized as direct lobbying. Little counterintuitive until you kind of walk through it like that. One thing I'll mention is it's actually kind of good that ballot measures are considered direct lobbying, because go back to our lobbying limits piece. You're allowed to do way more direct lobbying than you are grassroots. And if you get involved in a ballot initiative or proposition, it can be expensive if you're going to be doing a lot of work around it, doing a lot of door knocking or things along those lines. The one time when you can go to your way. If you do it for a candidate, you lose your tax status. You do it for this, you count it as lobbying. What doesn't count as legislation? This is super helpful for much of the work that you're going to be doing as well. Anything that is regulatory for state regulatory agencies, anything that's an executive order, anything that's talking about the change in enforcement of an existing law, or that's litigation based. In all of these instances, the law has already been passed by the legislature, state, federal, or local. And what these are typically the executive branch that are sort of filling in the gaps, that are enforcing the rules, that are interpreting the law, that are making it all happen. None of that is lobbying activity for purposes of these federal limits. Now, again, the state of Maryland may say, oh, if you talk to our regulatory agencies, we're going to want you to report on that, but they're never going to limit how much you can do. This is where a lot of rubber meets the road in terms of advocacy work. Oh, by the way, since none of this counts as lobbying activity, you're not limited by restrictive clauses to spend grant money on this type of work. Why? Again, it's not lobbying activity. So you can see how what can feel very restrictive in certain circumstances, when you scratch beneath the surface, it becomes less so. There's a lot of room to maneuver. So meeting with legislators and asking them to pass legislation to fund smart forestry practices. What do we think about that? Is that lobbying or is it not lobbying? Well, what I do is I always go through the elements. Okay, we're communicating for sure. We're communicating to a legislator because that's what the prompt is asking here. And we're asking them to pass legislation to fund smart forestry practices. Well, that hits all of the elements of direct lobbying. It's legal, you're allowed to do it. You want to do it with unrestricted funds, and you want to make sure that you're tracking the time that it takes for you to engage in that activity. Because if you're on a staff, or you're sending somebody on your staff who's paid to go do that work, that small amount of time that they spent relative to their paycheck is how much money you just spent on lobbying activity. You record that down and you save that to report to the IRS at the end of your fiscal year, or the end of your tax year, actually. We've got an entire publication called Keeping Track that gets into the how you track it and how you report it type of a thing. But this is lobbying activity, and for many of you, it doesn't get much more complicated than this. Another hypothetical here. If you're advocating before the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to add the whitebark pine to the endangered species list, is this lobbying activity? Well, you can see here American Forest did this type of work, I think it was a couple of years ago. Yeah, a couple of years ago. A little bit less than that. This actually is not going to be considered lobbying activity. And why is that? Because this is a regulatory agency. The Endangered Species Act was passed decades ago. This is the administrative agency taking the authority that Congress gave it to declare or to list or to delist all sorts of different types of species, and advocating for listing or delisting. That's not a legislative act, and therefore it is not considered lobbying activity. You can do a whole bunch of advocacy and be really involved in policy work around forestry in all sorts of different ways and not report a single dollar of lobbying, because there's tons of opportunity to do non-lobbying advocacy in the work that you do. So not lobbying activity. I want to cover the call to action requirement. Remember, when we're talking to the general public, it's not lobbying if all you do is go, hey, general public, we think that this bill is the greatest idea in the history of democracy. Never before has there been a smarter, better bill considered by a legislative body. If that's all you say, I mean, it's a little over the top, stipulated, but that's not lobbying. It's not lobbying until you add the following. Hey, go contact your senator. You ask them to contact a legislator. That's one of 4 different types of calls to action. If you don't have a call to action, if you don't have one of these 4 things, your public pronouncement is not considered grassroots lobbying. The most common is, hey, go contact your legislator, or contact Senator Smith, or, more specific. It's got to at least be your legislator. That if you just say, Congress is considering this bill, that's not enough information. It's got to be contact your congressperson. That would be enough. Another one, the second one is, you can tell that this law was passed in the 1970s because it's a very quaint call to action. It's providing the telephone number or the snail mail address of the legislative body. That used to be more important. It's a little bit less so in 2026, but it counts just the same, so it's important to know that. The third one, back in the 1970s, they probably didn't think was very important, but oh boy, has it become important here in 2026. It's providing a mechanism. Back then, it was tear out this postcard in our mailed to you newsletter, put a stamp on it, and send it to your state legislator. Now it's put in your zip code and click here, and we will pre-fill out an email for you that will tell your congressperson to support this piece of legislation. Providing a mechanism is as important as anything else these days. The last one is kind of like the second one. It's not as important, but we need to know that it exists because we don't want to do it by mistake. And that is just identifying legislators who are opposed to your point of view or undecided relative to your point of view. So just naming names of legislators can count. Naming a bill, if a bill is known by the sponsors, naming the sponsors is actually an exception to this. But anybody else, you just name the name of a random legislator who is opposed to your point of view or undecided, that's considered a call to action. Not super effective, but counts just the same. Here's an example from, I think, in the last year. I used to do a lot of work with Waterkeeper Alliance back in the day, and they were doing a ton of work on PFAS issues and asking your followers in a newsletter or on social media to contact senators to fund cleanup. That's going to be considered, is that going to be considered lobbying? Yeah, grassroots lobbying. Why? Because what we're doing, we know we're communicating, we're talking to the general public. By the way, open internet, always general public. We know we've got a call to action. Urge your senators. The key here that trips people up from time to time is, wait a second, I don't see a bill number. I don't see the title of a bill. you don't need that. It just has to identify the legislation enough so that someone would know what you're talking about. Adequately fund PFAS cleanup, that's going to be considered enough. That, it's in a budget bill someplace, and this is enough to identify that. This would be grassroots lobbying. What happens if you don't have the call to action? Well, I already told you what ends up happening. It ends up making something that might be really decent advocacy. It's giving your point of view on a piece of legislation, but without a call to action, it's not considered lobbying activity. Opportunity to do that with restricted funds, you're certainly allowed to do that. Or if for some reason there's another compelling reason not to engage in lobbying activity, just simply remove the call to action. Does it make it a little less effective? Sure, but it's advocacy, and so all advocacy is pretty good, I think, when all is said and done. Here's another example here. The climate crisis won't wait, and neither will we. This is another American Forests, I guess it's an Instagram post. This is public advocacy to combat climate change with an ask to support your work, right? So this is a pretty straightforward thing. Now, it's very clear. It's against climate change, right? We don't care for it. And it's saying, hey, throw us a few bucks, support our work. That's not going to be lobbying activity. Why? Because it doesn't include a call to action. There might be some pieces of legislation that are out there that are meant to combat climate change. Maybe not in this Congress, but prior Congresses maybe. And so as a result, this could possibly be considered to include legislative reference very broadly. It's kind of on the line there, but we know that it's not lobbying because there's no call to action in there in this public communication. So lots of different opportunities for you to advocate. This clearly is a good advocacy piece on social media. Just doesn't count as lobbying activity, and that's okay. Advocacy is good. Biodiversity is a win for cities and nature. This is from the Arbor Day Foundation. This is in this particular, again, Instagram post, explaining the importance of biodiversity for healthy urban ecosystems. There's no legislation mentioned, and there's no call to action. Well, I said there's no call to action and no legislation. It's clearly not lobbying. But this is a helpful piece. It's a little bit of a think piece. It's a little bit of an education piece. It doesn't matter whether you call this education, non-lobbying advocacy. The important thing is that it's outside of those definitions, and therefore you can do as much of this work as you would like. So here's another example here from American Forests. Learn about our wildfire policy platform, and they've got a link there as well. If you link a non-lobbying social media post like this one, there's no call to action in here at all, to something that contains lobbying or has a legislative call to action. So let's say that link there, that wildfire policy, contains a call to action or otherwise contains grassroots lobbying, that would end up counting this post as lobbying as well. It's what we call the one-click rule. And the idea here is that anytime you put a link, a URL, on anything, could be print, could be online, it's considered taking whatever is at the end of that link and it's incorporating it by reference, which is a fancy legal term for saying you may as well put all of that information in that particular Instagram post there. Now, in this particular instance, if you went to that link back in the time, I'm not even sure if it's still a live link or not. I think it's almost 2 years old. This post didn't do that. That actually linked to something that is going to be a lobbying exception that I think is really well suited for the type of work that you do. So we'll get to that in a minute here. But this non-lobbying activity, we're not too worried. We're not concerned about this particular post. But anytime you link out to something, make sure you know what's at the other end of it, because if it completes the lobbying requirements with that link, it ends up counting the whole thing as lobbying activity. So you just want to be careful about all of that. Know what you're linking to all the time. There's my best practice for you today. When do we need to start being concerned about tracking our expenses? When do we start the clock on this? When are we going to start to fill out our timesheets that say lobbying? When the primary purpose of your research or your meeting prep or anything like that is around lobbying activity, that's probably when you want to start tracking all of that, because the IRS rules say prep work counts. So it's not just when you go up and have that conversation with a legislator. It's not when you hit send on the email to your lists, urging everybody to call their senators. No, it's the work going into it. It's the drafting, it's the layout, it's the meetings that we have to determine whether, how we're going to do these things. That all counts as lobbying too. So if the work that you're doing is in furtherance of lobbying activity, you should be recording your time and recording your expenses around all of that. That's when we start the clock. Lobbying exceptions. I've got a few more minutes and I want to make sure that I at least cover a couple of these because these are two that I think are fairly helpful for you in the type of work that you do. And the first one is what I alluded to before, what that link out was to. It's a nonpartisan analysis, study, or research. They all have really long names for reasons I'm unclear on. It's like Congress got paid by the word back then. So what is this? These tend to have policy agendas in them. They may even have draft legislation in them, but they have a take. They are of substance. They're not a one-pager. They're not just a tweet, but they've got some real substance behind them. Example on the screen here, Restoring America's Forests for Wildfire Resilience and a Changing Climate. If you took a look at that, there actually were real deal policy recommendations in it that ordinarily would be considered legislative, well, not ordinarily, they are legislative proposals. The thing about the nonpartisan analysis is that if you do this good report, you can raise other points of view and you can dismiss them. You could say there are other thoughts out there by other organizations and they're wrong and we're right and here's why. That's fine. You could even argue against do nothing proposals, like in other words, oh no, the status quo is fine. We don't need to restore America's forests. You can say that's a bad idea too. So that's the substance of these reports. And many of your organizations, I'm sure, do this kind of stuff. You may be really focused on doing this type of work. It's not lobbying if you get it out there, put it on your website, disseminate it to media, to your allies, and most importantly, to every single member of the legislative body whose policies you're trying to influence. That's the key right there. If you gave it just to those legislators, you're not complying with the requirement here. It's got to be publicly available and be that full and fair discussion. If you do those two things, none of the work that you put into it is lobbying. None of the distribution costs, the print costs if they're printed. By the way, this doesn't have to be a print report. This could be a podcast. It could be a YouTube documentary. Anything that is of that full and fair discussion. What can't it be? A tweet, a one-pager. It's just not enough. It's got to have some depth to it. This is, I think, the best lobbying exception that's out there. I think it's excellent advocacy work. There are doubtlessly organizations that you work with that you think are really, really involved in policy activity, and maybe they report zero lobbying because they live in this exception. This is the kind of stuff that I always encourage groups to utilize as a tool, especially if you're new to advocacy. This is a real easy way for you to kind of up the game a little bit, make some connections with legislators, but you're outside of the definitions of lobbying because this is a lobbying exception. Very, very handy. Technical assistance. This one's narrow, but super handy. I call this one the permission slip exception. If you get an invitation in writing by the chair of a committee or a subcommittee, I'm going to say this one more time because all of this stuff has to happen. An invitation in writing by the chair of a committee or subcommittee, cannot be by their assistant, cannot be by a ranking member, can't be by someone who sits way at the end that's a friend of your organization. No, it's got to be by the chair of the committee and it's got to be in writing. If they invite you to come testify or serve on a blue ribbon panel to help write legislation, that invitation, that permission slip, means none of what you do is lobbying activity. And it is handy as heck. It also is a golden opportunity to really participate in the formulation of legislation without any of it counting as lobbying activity. So I'm going to skip the examinations and discussions just because it's a belt and suspenders one, and I'm going to have you read more about it in one of the guides that we've got. I want to make sure that I have more time for questions for you all. Here's another example question for you. Is it IRS lobbying if you invite a governor to learn? I have a typo in there. I just noticed. Yay me. If you invite a governor to learn more about your community and what you do, do we think that's lobbying activity? Well, you're talking to a governor, and I said before that sometimes governors are considered legislators, but that's usually only when they're involved in something having to do with legislation, right? So here we're just kind of inviting them to take a tour of our facility or introducing them to your staff and telling them about the good work that you do to preserve and enhance forests in the state. Yeah, that's not going to be lobbying activity. Is that a good, important meeting to take? Are you going to advance your cause because of that? Absolutely. You want to make sure that you do that kind of stuff all the time when you can. All right, so before we get into questions, and we've got actually a fairly robust amount of time, which is great, some takeaways for you. If you are a 501c3, and I think you all are, you can legally advocate and lobby. You're limited in how much lobbying you can do, but you still can do a lot of it. The state laws, Maryland state laws, never limit how much lobbying you can do, but they might require disclosure. I've got a resource that I'm going to include in the emails that'll go to all of you and will get distributed about those rules. We just focused in on the federal rules here this afternoon. The IRS limits how much lobbying you can do. We talked about what those limits look like and the choices that you have. Most importantly, I'm here to help you today, but beyond, I'm going to make sure that you have contact information. If you ever have any questions on any of this kind of stuff, please feel free to reach out to us at Boulder Advocacy. We can give free technical assistance if you get in touch with us about any of this kind of stuff. We're lawyers. We can't be your lawyer. It's not legal advice, but we can help maybe demystify some of the rules for things that you've got. And this is a little bit of a summary of what I talked about before about what the various laws have here. We've got disclosure rules at the state and local level, and we've got the limitations at the federal level as well. Resources available for you if you are not tired of hearing me talk, which is always an open question at about this point in any presentation I give. We've got a podcast called Rules of the Game, which gets into all of the different types of ins and outs of these rules as applying to nonprofits. This week, we did actually an unusual episode where we talked about name, image, and likeness, NIL deals, because it has a lot to do with nonprofits. So maybe not so much forestry related, but very much nonprofit advocacy related. So check that out. We've got stuff that's much more on point around lobbying activity in the 135 episodes I think that we've done. Practical guidance in Maryland is what I've been alluding to about the local disclosure rules. That's a great read. It's super easy to follow and will give you answers to a lot of your questions on those disclosure rules that you may need to be dealing with. And of course, the best resource for what I talked about today, keeping track about record keeping, and the terribly named but very excellent publication, Being a Player. That's all about these lobbying rules at the federal level. So that's what I got. This is where you're going to get in touch with us if you have questions after the fact. Advocacy@afj.org is probably your best bet. You might get me, you might get one of my colleagues. We're all across these fine United States. We're based out of DC mainly, so you might get one of my colleagues back in the DC office who I used to work with more closely before I moved to here in, the snow has stopped. I was going to say snowy Seattle, but all right, so we are going to take any questions that you've got, and I think Gary and Megan are going to help me with that.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Tim. Yeah, that was a lot of information that's very new to me, but presented in a really accessible way for what is, I'm sure, multiple graduate level courses of knowledge. So thank you for that. Okay. I'll just remind folks, please enter your questions into the Q&A box for Tim to respond. I'm sure there's a lot of questions out there, and we want to use his time well to get those answered. While we wait for folks to type in, something I'm curious about is, you mentioned a bit about, I guess, the scary consequence of losing your tax-exempt status if you're violating these rules. How are violations of these rules usually turned up? Is it through standard reviews or reporting?
I think that getting audited by the IRS on any of this stuff independently is about as likely as me being hit by lightning right now inside. It does not happen, really. So, for the most part, any kind of accusation around a loss of a revocation level type of an event is going to come through a complaint. All complaints get routed through the Dallas field office, and it is a completely opaque process. And we never know what ends up happening with these types of things. Revocation investigations are completely private, so they're not made public in any type of way. There are statistics that are put out, and the statistics are basically this: the IRS does not do this very often. Even around election activity, which has a higher threshold of consequence, where revocation is really on the table, we're talking a handful of revocations a year of the thousands and thousands of organizations. That's around election activity. Around the stuff I've been talking about, I've literally never heard of a revocation around lobbying activity. The types of things that end up happening if you go over your limits tend to be what we call intermediate sanctions, which is a fancy legal term for saying we're going to do a little bit less than we need to, than we can. You're going to get a letter that says, "Don't do that again." That's what we call a corrective action. You're going to get an excise tax. If you're working under those 501H rules and you go over, you actually self-report. You go, "Oops, we went over by $1,000," and you pay, a percentage. It's not a fine; it's an excise tax technically, but you actually report it and you send the check with your Form 990. So even the IRS doesn't even do it; you do it. To stay on the right side of things. So for the most part, the IRS is sort of, has this reputation of being this big bad agency that comes in and we're afraid of them as tax exempt organizations. As long as you're acting in good faith and you're following these rules, there's usually very little to be worried about. At the state level, states are often much more aggressive in terms of the enforcement of their rules. And so if I was to say you want to pay most attention to those state rules, because those will be enforced more frequently, and there's often fines and other types of things that the state will levy against you, and that's just a pain. You never want to pay fines if you can avoid it, and that's why we've got all of these resources to try to demystify this stuff for folks so that they know, hey, you do a little bit of lobbying and you fill out the form once a year, you're going to be fine, and everybody's going to leave you alone and let you do your advocacy.
Great, thank you. And another question that comes to mind, I know a lot of our participants on the in the audience today are parts of our local forestry boards, and Gary, please jump in and correct me. We've been restructuring the forestry boards, but I believe that they're all still part of the association of forestry boards as kind of like the umbrella entity. So basically, do we need to kind of be keeping tabs and agglomerating like all of the individual efforts and sort of grouping them together to determine, whether we are meeting or exceeding certain thresholds?
Yeah, I mean, the good news is that regardless of how they're organized or reorganizing, if they are, these aren't considered legislative bodies. And so as a result, any advocacy before I'll say entities, but before these boards is never going to count your count against your lobbying cap space, the stuff that I was talking about primarily. It may be that they're considered covered entities under Maryland's disclosure rules, and for that I'll refer you to the Maryland guide that I've got there. Typically speaking, and the reason I'm hedging a bit here because I don't know the answer off the top of my head, because otherwise I'd have to pay attention to 50 states and DC and my brain would explode. Typically, that's not the type of entity that's considered a covered entity, but I would make double sure and check and make sure. That would require disclosure only. You wouldn't be limited in how much you can do. So regardless of what the potential reorganization that you alluded to is, it's not going to end up contemplating a lot of the stuff that I talked about.
Tim, I want to make a comment and a question. First, a question, and that is one of the most common questions that we get constantly is that local candidates and delegates, even when they're not candidates for office right then, but they're just legislators, frequently uh, do different fundraising activities and ask for the purchase of tickets to their event so that you can find out what their position is on an issue. It provides, in a sense, common ground with which to talk with them one-on-one, which might otherwise not be as accessible for many. So my question is buying a ticket to an event at which legislators appear considered an endorsement? And how does that work out?
It could be, and it depends on the nature of the event and what is the organizing entity around it. It sounds like that it would be their campaign committee. And if it is their campaign committee or their political party that's doing the organization, we're in another type of nonprofit that I didn't cover today, and that is a 527 organization.
Wow.
All they do is try to get people elected or defeated. And that is sort of if C3s are water, that's oil. We don't want to be messing with that too much. And the reason is that it's not so much the meeting that's the issue, it's the expenditure that's the issue. Because what you'd be doing as a C3 is you'd be giving money, you'd be making an expenditure in furtherance of a 527, the campaign committee's attempts to reelect their person. And that would be over the line. So what is available? You could go to a variety of other types of events that aren't related to their campaign. But anything that's campaign run or related, that's something you're going to want to stay away from. And particularly, you'll want to stay away from making any expenditures in furtherance of that.
Does the involvement of something like the Blue, I can't remember the name of the organization, but it is a standard organization in which candidates accept donations. Is anything processed by them automatically assumed to be an endorsement?
You may be thinking of Act Blue. Is that
Yeah,
who you were thinking
that's
of?
the
Yeah.
one. Thank you. Yes, I
So
appreciate it.
Act Blue comes in a couple of different flavors. There's an Act Blue, and they have slightly different names, but all of them sort of have Act Blue in them. One of the flavors is for candidate stuff. Another flavor is going to be for 501c4 stuff. Another flavor I think it's called Act Blue Charity. That will sometimes be for organizations that are like ours, and that you do fundraising through Act Blue Charities, and that's fine. So the key is taking a look at the fine print and figuring out what is actually the fundraising apparatus, and also making sure that you're understanding, okay, who's the organization that's around all of this? A little bit of sleuthing on a website or a sign-up page usually goes pretty far in all of this. And I'll plug our podcast once again. We actually did one called, I think, what do we call it? Nonprofit Detective, I think was the name of the episode. Exactly this kind of stuff. How to parse that language to figure out whether or not this is something you can do.
Well, that's extremely helpful. The foundation has been very active in providing white papers on policy issues, and also we have, which you're participating in, a webinar series which frequently touches on policy issues. Are any of those things at risk in this discussion as far as you're concerned about lobbying? We've always said no, and I just would think it's good to go on the record and find out whether or not you agree with that assertion.
Yeah, the white papers almost certainly comply with the nonpartisan analysis, study, and research exception. I'd have to, you have to dig into the content, of course, but
Sure.
if they're distributed widely, like so many of them are, it almost always will comply with that.
All of ours are widely available.
Perfect. Yeah, and a training series like this, often it will be broad enough that it won't include lobbying language, but from time to time, you could get a speaker in here who's going to be saying, "Hey, it's really important that we all get together and we get this portion of the state budget passed because it's really important and all of us support that." Well, that might be considered grassroots lobbying because it's, "Hey, everybody, here's this piece of legislation. Now you should all go contact your legislator." That could be considered grassroots lobbying. So you just got to be cognizant of the content.
Even though we don't pay for the webinars or pay the people to be on the webinar. In other words, there's no funds involved in it. And so if we take a broad position on data centers, for example,
Sure.
which are politically controversial right now, as you well know,
Sure.
I mean, I always thought since there's no money involved, that it really didn't count.
The one thing that I would say that you have to be mindful of is if there are folks who are paid staff members that are participating,
Yes,
their organizations are they're spending money right now. My organization is spending money on me right now to sit here and talk to you. I haven't done any lobbying activity, so I'm not going to fill out my timesheet saying that I did. But if we were doing grassroots lobbying activity, I was present at a thing where that was happening, that might end up counting. If you are just participating and you're listening to someone grassroots lobby you, you didn't engage in that. But the organization that was responsible for having that person there to give that message, they are communicating to the general public, expressing a view about specific legislation with a call to action. So they would be. The answer is it depends.
So our panelist has to count it, but we do not. Is that a fair interpretation of what you said?
Yeah, and with the possible exception of whether or not your creation of the forum was designed because you also agree with that grassroots lobbying message. In other words, you brought the person out there to help your grassroots lobbying efforts, then it would be
I understand.
your
Obviously.
time as well, not just in attendance.
I understand. That's very helpful, Tim. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Megan, do we have any additional questions? Because I think we're about at the end of our time, and Tim has done an absolutely wonderful job of providing an overview for this activity. And Tim, I want to thank you very much for making this information available to us. And I look forward to the follow-up that you mentioned earlier and receiving that so that we can make that available for any questions that we might receive.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's my pleasure. I see we got a couple of questions. I might be able to do kind of speed round real quick.
No,
Shirley asked.
I'm willing to take a few more minutes. This is rather.
Okay. Yeah. I don't want to step on anything here, but I always hate to leave folks hanging if we can.
We'll give it 5. Go ahead, Megan.
Sure. Yeah. For our lightning round.
Citizens check their legislators. Yeah, right. About a non-mandate item, or is that considered unpermitted lobbying? I don't know what a non-mandate item is. If it is legislation, that would be grassroots lobbying. So unless if that non-mandate item is a piece of pending legislation or a policy proposal before a legislative body, that would count as grassroots lobbying. It's permitted. You're limited in how much you can do. Then the next question was, my organization has an IRS-C3 group exemption for over 70 clubs. Would this lobby the act? The answer is yes, because your letter covers all of those individual organizations. They are under your tax status, and so all of those clubs hopefully are giving you any information if they engaged in any lobbying activity, because you are the one filling out the Form 990 at the end of every tax year. And so, yes, you're going to want to make sure you have mechanisms in place that tell all of these individual clubs if they engage in lobbying to make sure they get you the info. So yeah, there we did. Speed round.
Excellently done. Yeah. Thank you.
That was a speed answer if I ever heard it. Thank you. Megan, are we ready to draw to a close?
I believe so. Yeah. I will just echo your thanks to Tim. This was a really informative and great session. So thank you so much.
Absolutely. It's my pleasure.
Again, I want to thank Tim and his organization for providing us the opportunity to bring to all of you this information about advocacy versus lobbying, or how the two differ, and ultimately why we can be responsive to both concepts. I want to ask all of you to join us next month for another edition of Framing the Future. We'll be talking about the Forest Conservation Act, its updates provided by the legislature 2 years ago, and how the agency is working to implement those at the local level. So we'll be turning to DNR for an update on the Forest Conservation Act. Join us again in March for This Is Framing the Future. Thank you very much for joining us for this edition. Good evening and have a good day, all of you.